In the quiet mist of an Istanbul dawn in 1623, before the muezzin's call broke the air, a sound was said to pierce the heart of the Topkapi Palace, a scream so raw, so human, that even the eunuchs standing guard dared not move. It did not come from battle, nor from rebellion. It came from a girl, a princess, no older than 15. Her name was Fatima Sultan, daughter of one of the most powerful rulers on earth. No chronicler recorded that cry. You won't find it in the Ottoman archives, nor in the golden ink of imperial histories, but in whispers passed through generations of attendants, scribes, and courtiers. They say that scream marked the moment innocence died inside the walls of empire. Some claim it was a ritual, others a punishment. All agreed on one thing: it was the price every daughter of a sultan paid when she came of age, a tax not written in gold or glory, but in obedience and fear. For centuries, Europe admired the Ottoman court, its music, its silks, its majesty. Yet behind those jeweled gates, storytellers whispered of a darker rhythm, one of submission and silence. Historians have never confirmed the rumors. Officially, there was no ceremony of breaking, but tales persisted of secret rites designed not to celebrate royal women, but to erase them. Behind every glittering marriage alliance, behind every banquet and procession, lay an unspoken rule. A princess was not born to live freely, but to be used, bound, bartered, and silenced. The empire stretched across continents, from the mountains of the Balkans to the deserts of Arabia. It was a machine of conquest and control, a civilization that conquered worlds but struggled to free its own women. And at its heart stood Topkapi Palace, the jewel of Istanbul, a labyrinth of marble halls, perfumed courtyards, and secret rooms where history was written not by the Sultan's pen, but by the tears of those hidden behind the curtains. Here, politics and passion shared a single bed. Within these walls lived the imperial harem, a world within a world, home to more than 800 women. To outsiders, it was a paradise of luxury. In truth, it was a kingdom of rules, where even the flutter of a veil could shift destinies. From the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, the harem transformed from a pleasure house into a political engine. Concubines, once nameless captives from distant lands, rose to power, influencing wars, treaties, and thrones. Some, like Kösem Sultan and Turhan Hatice Sultan, wielded power that made generals tremble. But the Sultan's daughters, the imperial princesses, had no such fortune. They were born not to rise, but to be offered. For them, privilege was a disguise for captivity. While concubines could fight their way to influence, royal daughters were bound to the fate written before their birth. Marriage as a transaction, a tool to cement alliances, control governors, and silence rivals. And among these daughters stood Fatima Sultan, the brilliant child of Sultan Ahmed Furfur, and Kösem Sultan, a woman often described as the shadow ruler of the empire. Fatima's childhood was golden, music echoing in garden courtyards, scholars teaching her languages and astronomy, poets praising her as a jewel of the dynasty. By 15, she was fluent in 4 tongues and wise beyond her years. But the brilliance that charmed the palace would soon become her curse. For in the Ottoman world, intelligence in a princess was not a blessing. It was a danger. It meant she could question the role she was born to play. The court had already chosen her husband, Kara Mustafa Pasha, a hardened commander twice her age, a soldier seasoned by wars, feared by enemies, and loyal to the throne. For him, the marriage was an honor, a political assent. For Fatima, it was the beginning of a descent into a ritual that would break her body and her will. The empire called it Turvil-i Mubarak, a sacred preparation. To later historians, it was something else entirely, a systematic method of obedience. In the final months before her wedding, the palace began to transform. Behind silk screens and closed doors, Fatima Sultan entered a world of control disguised as ceremony. Her tutor was an elderly woman named Gulnar Hatun, a figure both respected and feared. Officially, she was a mentor, guiding the princess in royal etiquette. But her lessons, it was said, were closer to conditioning than education. The young girl's chamber became her prison. Every day she rehearsed acts of humility, bowing at measured angles, walking in silence, lowering her eyes in calculated submission. Her vocabulary was reduced to 4 words: thank you, forgive me, I obey, I accept. Each mistake, a misstep, a delayed bow, a trembling word, invited punishment, fasting, isolation. Or worse, the reflection cell, a candle-lit room where silence stretched for hours, sometimes days, until the prisoner's will broke like glass. Rumors from attendants described even darker practices: rehearsals for the wedding night using wax mannequins crafted by Venetian artisans. The princess, they whispered, was forced to mimic gestures no child should be asked to know. Resistance was met with more instruction. Whether these stories were true or distorted by time, one fact remains. Fatima Sultan's final days as a child ended not with a celebration, but with a slow and deliberate erasure of self. Twice each week, she was ordered to serve her father's concubines, bathing them, dressing them, preparing their perfumes. For the daughter of the Sultan, it was humiliation beyond measure. Yet the message was clear: even the Sultan's lovers stood above her in hierarchy. Soon she was transferred to the Helin Köşkü, the bridal pavilion, an isolated complex where every sound was regulated and every gesture observed. Her diet was restricted to symbolic foods: pomegranates, goat's milk, honey, and elixirs laced with calming herbs. Some claimed they were alchemical potions meant to suppress emotion and induce obedience. Bathing, once a symbol of purity, became another act of control. The attendants immersed her in oils of poppy and valerian, perfumes of peace that dulled resistance. Even the walls whispered her fate. The tapestries displayed scenes of obedient wives, eyes cast down, praised for fertility and silence. Mirrors lined every corner, so that wherever she turned, she faced her own reflection, a form of Sufi meditation perverted into surveillance. The princess began to change. Her laughter, once the music of the gardens, faded. Her words came slower, until eventually they ceased. The child prodigy who once debated scholars now spoke only in whispers. Her days became a ritual of obedience. Her prayers were rewritten, no longer addressed to God for guidance, but to her future husband, as a divine duty. Her studies shifted from astronomy and philosophy to the reading of Nasihat al-Muluk, a manual preaching submission and loyalty as virtues. Witnesses claimed her transformation was so profound that even her mother, the powerful Kösem Sultan, began to avoid visiting her chamber, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of fear. By March 1623, Istanbul prepared for the grandest of weddings. The empire buzzed with music and celebration. Trumpets, drums, and the scent of incense filled the air. For the people, it was a day of pride. For Fatima Sultan, it was the march toward an unseen grave. Chroniclers wrote of her pallor, her trembling hands, her dry lips, her unsteady breath. Today we might call it panic. Then it was dismissed as virginal melancholy. The city glittered with banquets and dances, foreign guests and grand ceremonies. And when the final feast ended, the crowd cheered for the union that promised peace and power. But within the bridal chamber, another reality waited. Fatima was bathed in rosewater and sandalwood, her skin anointed with oils said to calm the spirit, though whispers claimed they contained drops of opium. Her gown shimmered with pearls, but its layers were so heavy she could barely move. The very garment that symbolized her majesty now functioned as her cage. In a nearby hall, Kara Mustafa Pasha received counsel from elder statesmen. Some say their advice was gentle, to approach the knight with respect. Others claim it was far darker, instructing him to assert dominance, to conquer as a warrior does. The truth lies buried between those two tales, but the result was the same: a ritual where love had no place, only power. When Fatima entered the octagonal chamber, walls draped in tapestries of Ottoman victories, she stepped into the empire's most intimate battlefield. Servants remained close, listening through the latticework for any disruption, for any sign the ritual might fail. And in the hours that followed, the empire gained a marriage, but lost a voice Accounts written decades later describe her collapse, fainting, silence, and blood like the departure of the soul. Whether exaggerated or not, the message was clear. The girl who entered the chamber never returned. In the days after, court physicians recorded her condition as muteness and fever of the mind. She no longer spoke, no longer smiled. Her eyes, once bright with intellect, became distant, as if she were still trapped in that mirrored room. They prescribed music, poetry, and prayer. Nothing worked. The brilliance that once made her father proud had been extinguished, replaced by a quiet, ghostly compliance. The empire carried on with its triumphs. Banquets continued, wars were fought, alliances sealed. But in the golden corridors of Topkapi, one girl's silence became the unspoken price of stability. Because behind every great empire's glory lies a story the chronicles refuse to tell. And in Fatima Sultan's story, in that one scream before dawn, we glimpse the truth of how power consumes its own children. But Fatima's tragedy was not unique. Others followed the same path. Princesses whose fates vanished into sealed records, whose lives ended in silence or madness. And one forbidden document, said to have been smuggled from the archives centuries later, may reveal what happened to them, and why. The months that followed Fatima Sultan's wedding were a slow descent into darkness. She appeared in public beside her husband, draped in jewels and silks, every inch the perfect princess. The people bowed, the poets praised, and the court chroniclers called her marriage a divine union. But within the walls of the bridal pavilion, her silence was growing, vast, suffocating, unbreakable. The young woman who once filled the palace with music now walked like a ghost through its corridors. Servants described her moving without sound, her eyes lowered, her lips moving in silent prayer. Even her mother, Kösem Sultan, known across the empire for her iron will, seemed powerless to reach her daughter. The Sultan's physicians tried everything: honey infusions, Sufi chants, verses whispered through burning amber smoke. Yet nothing restored her voice or her light. They called it a fever of the soul. We would call it trauma. But the palace did not stop for tragedy. Empires rarely do. While Fatima drifted in and out of consciousness, the Ottoman court pulsed with its usual rhythm of politics and deceit. Wars in the east, treaties in the west, rebellions simmering in the Balkans. The empire never slept. And yet, in the quiet corners of Topkapi, whispers began to rise. Eunuchs, concubines, and attendants murmured that something sacred had been violated, that a curse had entered the bloodline. Some swore they saw Fatima wandering the gardens at night, barefoot, her gown soaked with dew, speaking softly to the fountains as though they might answer her. Others claimed she refused food and sleep, and that her fainting fits were so frequent that attendants had to carry her like a child back to her chambers. In one account, dismissed by official historians, a maid wrote that Fatima had begun embroidering cryptic symbols into her veils, patterns that seemed to repeat the same phrase again and again: "I am not yours." Her husband, Kara Mustafa Pasha, meanwhile, turned away from home. Military campaigns were his escape. He threw himself into wars against Persia, into council meetings and long nights of opium and silence. The marriage endured because it had to, not out of affection, but out of politics. The empire needed appearances to be maintained. In the court's public ceremonies, Fatima appeared radiant, a figure of serenity, but her attendants later confessed that every public smile was followed by hours of shaking and tears. She could barely stand after each appearance. And yet, her suffering remained invisible to those in power. For in the Ottoman world, pain within the harem was not history. It was property. What happened behind those marble walls belonged to the Sultan, not to truth. Historians later tried to piece together what little evidence survived. A few personal letters, fragments of poems, notes from physicians. One entry, dated 1625, reads simply, "Her pulse falters when the drums of celebration sound." The empire's grandeur marched on, but for the women trapped within its sanctuaries of luxury, each victory felt like another stone added to their invisible prison. Over time, the pattern repeated. Other princesses, Aisha, Beyhan, Geverhan, were each married off to commanders, governors, and statesmen, all for reasons of diplomacy. None of their fates were recorded in full. Some disappeared entirely from the archives after marriage, their names replaced by lines like "withdrawn due to illness." Behind the scenes, concubines still played their dangerous game of influence and intrigue. The sultanate of women continued, shaping the destiny of the empire through cunning and manipulation. But the true-born daughters, the ones of royal blood, had no such power. They were sacrifices made to hold the empire together. The tragedy of Fatima Sultan was not that she died young, but that she lived long, almost 30 years, in quiet servitude to a role she never chose. By the 1640s, she was little more than a symbol, paraded at ceremonies, seated beside her husband like a carved idol of obedience. Chroniclers wrote that her eyes reflected stillness like water, a poetic phrase that barely masked the truth. Her mind had retreated beyond reach. At night, attendants said she still sat before mirrors, tracing the outlines of her reflection, whispering words no one understood. Some claimed she spoke to her younger self, the girl who once dreamed of charting stars and writing poetry. By 1652, her health had collapsed entirely. Fever gripped her body, and the physicians declared it a divine summons. She died on March 15th, the very date of her wedding night. To the court, it was coincidence. To those who remembered her screams, it was the empire's final act of possession. And yet her death did not silence the rumors. It gave them wings. For years after, foreign travelers, diplomats, and spies arriving in Istanbul wrote strange accounts of the Sultan's daughters, always beautiful, always silent, their eyes distant, their smiles unearthly. One Venetian envoy noted, "The princesses of this court are like statues of porcelain, admired by all, touched by none, and hollow within." Europe saw the empire's splendor, but never its sorrow. The palaces shone, the ceremonies dazzled, but beneath the surface lay a machinery of silence perfected over centuries. The tragedy of Fatima Sultan was more than personal, it was systemic. It was a design of empire itself, to take brilliance and turn it into obedience, to make even royalty bow to the unseen chains of politics. The empire that prided itself on conquering cities had perfected a quieter conquest, the conquest of spirit. Centuries later, historians combing through Ottoman archives found traces, just traces, of what had happened. Notes buried under layers of bureaucracy, unsigned letters written in cautious hands, medical reports describing nervous afflictions of the royal daughters. No one dared call it what it was, yet patterns emerged, princess after princess showing the same symptoms: loss of speech, fainting, emotional withdrawal, and eventual disappearance from records. The euphemisms were chilling: withdrawn to contemplation, consumed by melancholy, surrendered to divine silence. In some cases, there were sudden deaths, always unexplained, always conveniently timed. Among the whispers that survived, one story stands out: the tale of a princess who, unable to endure the ritual of obedience, embroidered her despair into her gowns. Each thread was a letter, woven backward, visible only to those who knew the code. The attendants who washed her garments claimed they could read words like mercy and freedom. Others spoke of princesses who sought to end their lives, or who begged to be sent to distant provinces, anything to escape the walls of Topkapi. Some even faked illnesses to remain unmarried, knowing that to wed was to die in spirit, if not in body. Still, the machine went on. For every Fatima, another daughter was born, another alliance arranged, another ritual prepared. And in this endless cycle, the Ottoman Empire continued to shine before the world, golden domes glittering, processions marching, ambassadors awestruck, all while its own daughters vanished quietly behind curtains of silk. To the outside eye, the empire seemed invincible. But beneath the marble floors, in the chambers no foreigner ever saw, the cost of that invincibility was being paid, not by soldiers, not by viziers, but by the women who could never speak their truth. Even in death, Fatima Sultan's story remained forbidden. Kosum Sultan ensured that her daughter received full royal honors, the marble tomb, the prayers, the ceremonies, but never her story. The empire that chronicled every battle and treaty could not find the words to describe a girl's suffering. And perhaps that silence was deliberate, because to admit what happened within those palaces would have been to expose the empire's greatest hypocrisy, that behind its magnificent legacy stood a foundation built on obedience, fear, and forgotten women. Today, the halls of Topkapi still stand. Tourists walk where sultans once ruled. The rooms of the harem shimmer in golden light. The fountains murmur softly. The scent of rosewater lingers. But if you listen closely, especially in the quiet before dawn, some say you can still hear it. That faint echo of a girl's scream trapped beneath centuries of marble and silence. It isn't just Fatima's voice. It's the chorus of every woman who lived and died unseen within those walls. The empire is gone. The palaces have become museums, but their silence remains alive, a monument to the price of power and the cost of obedience. Because every empire, no matter how glorious, is haunted by the voices it silenced, and as history unfolds its hidden pages, one truth becomes clear. Not all prisons are made of iron. Some are woven from silk, shaped by ritual and sealed by tradition. Fatima Sultan's tragedy is not merely a story of the past. It is a warning that when glory demands silence, when obedience is praised above will, when a voice is crushed in the name of duty, civilization itself begins to rot from within. Her name may have faded from textbooks, but her shadow still lingers across time. A silent reminder that beneath the gold and grandeur of every empire lies a graveyard of forgotten daughters. And so, as we close the curtain on this hidden chronicle, one question remains: how many more voices still sleep beneath the marble floors of history, waiting for someone to listen? If Fatima's silence could speak, perhaps it would tell us this: empires rise and fall, power changes hands, but the price of submission, once paid, is never forgotten.